The winter of 1943 settled over Europe like a gray shroud. Fog rolled across the Italian mountains, damp and bitter, clinging to the skin of every man who waited on the muddy airfields. You stand there now, boots heavy with wet earth, breath frosting in the early dawn. The sharp tang of aviation fuel cuts through the morning air, and from somewhere close by comes the metallic roar of twin propellers spinning to life. It is not a conventional silhouette that rises before you. It is something alien, a machine with two slender fuselages and a central cockpit suspended like the bridge of a warship. The mechanics call it the Lightning. To them, it is not just an airplane. It is a beast with two hearts. Across the front lines, in the taverns of Munich and the barracks of occupied France, Luftwaffe pilots laughed at it. They called it ungainly, a clumsy twin-tailed contraption that no real fighter ace would ever fear. A mistake in design, one German officer allegedly remarked, dismissing it as little more than a curiosity. And yet, history has a cruel way of twisting arrogance into tragedy. Imagine yourself at 25,000 feet. The canopy rattles as the engines thunder in perfect unison, propellers tearing thin air into ribbons. You lean forward, oxygen mask tight against your face, as condensation crystals glitter across the cockpit glass. Below you, black smoke coils upward from a burning rail yard. Somewhere in that haze, silver specks dart in formation, Messerschmitts, sleek and hungry. They expect to chase down the ungainly American intruders with ease. But today, the P-38 Lightning carries a surprise they do not expect: high-altitude performance and relentless range. The first head-on clash is a blur of motion and thunder. Gunfire flashes like strobe lights in the frozen sky. German confidence shatters in seconds as cannons miss their mark and Lightning pilots, using speed and altitude, reverse the fight. Twin engines mean twin chances for survival. Where one fails, the other claws the plane upward again. Pilots once mocked for flying forks suddenly rack up kills that change the balance of air war. I believe this is where the story demands to be told not as cold statistics but as lived experience. For every Lightning that took off, there was a pilot carrying fear, pride, and the unshakable weight of survival. You can almost hear the rapid scribble of a diary entry: "The Germans laughed at our machines. Tonight, they burn in their own fire." This filmic chronicle you are about to witness is not just about metal, engines, and numbers. It is about arrogance meeting innovation, and the price paid in smoke and blood when underestimation turns lethal. Stay with us, because in the next chapters, you will not only see how the P-38 Lightning rewrote the rules of air combat, you will feel it. And if this journey grips you, consider subscribing and joining our channel, where forgotten machines and buried stories return to the sky once more. By late 1942, the skies over Europe had become a chessboard painted in blood and smoke. The Luftwaffe, though battered by years of relentless operations, still held the upper hand in many theaters. Its aces were veterans of the Spanish Civil War, men who had honed their skills long before America even entered the conflict. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s were respected, feared, and, at least in their own circles, believed to be untouchable. Against this backdrop, the introduction of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning appeared almost laughable. In training grounds from Berlin to Lille, German pilots were shown photographs of the new American machine. With its twin booms and central nacelle, the Lightning looked nothing like the sleek, predatory shapes of traditional fighters. An engineer's indulgence, not a warrior's tool, one pilot scoffed in a letter home. For the Luftwaffe, it was a caricature, an ungainly fork-tailed curiosity that would collapse under real combat pressure. But the Americans saw something else. In the pages of wartime manuals and in the recollections of ground crews, the P-38 was described as complex, temperamental, but full of promise. It could reach higher altitudes than many contemporaries, fly farther on long-range missions, and, crucially, return home even if one engine failed. For bomber escorts crossing hostile skies from Britain to Germany, these traits were not luxuries, they were lifelines. Still, the Lightning's early service was troubled. In North Africa, pilots complained of cockpit heat so severe that maps sometimes curled and water bottles boiled. In the frigid reaches of Northern Europe, the opposite problem arose. engines struggled to deliver consistent power at extreme cold. Luftwaffe propaganda wasted no time exploiting these flaws. Pamphlets distributed to German troops described the P-38 as the hot stove of Africa, the cold coffin of Norway. Satire became weaponized morale. And yet, reality is never as simple as propaganda suggests. In dusty Allied airfields across Tunisia, mechanics improvised insulation, redesigned ducting, and patched systems together with the determination of men who knew every adjustment meant a life saved. Slowly, painfully, the lightning began to prove itself. Reports trickled back, longer patrols, daring interceptions, German bombers forced to scatter under its guns. One American pilot recalled in his diary, "The Germans still laugh at the shape of our ships. But they don't laugh when they see our contrails above theirs." This single line, though half buried in the folds of time, captures the shift in psychology that began to ripple across the European theater. What looked clumsy on the ground turned into a predator when altitude and speed were on its side. For the Luftwaffe, the problem was not immediately obvious. Arrogance has a way of masking danger until it is too late. Early dismissals of the P-38 lulled commanders into assuming it would never threaten their dominance. Even as Lightning squadrons began racking up victories in Italy and over the Mediterranean, German intelligence clung to the narrative that American engineering had overreached. "Two engines do not make two fighters," a Luftwaffe technical report dryly noted. Perhaps. But they made one fighter far harder to kill. The context of this clash goes beyond mere performance charts. The Allied bombing campaign was intensifying. Convoys of B-17s and B-24s surged deeper into occupied Europe, their losses mounting without sufficient escort. Britain's Spitfires and Hurricanes lacked the range to protect them all the way to their targets. The Lightning, with its long legs, promised to fill that void. Without it, bomber crews knew each mission was essentially a lottery against death. With it, survival odds began to tilt, however slightly, back in their favor. Yet the Lightning's reputation was not uniformly positive among its own ranks. Some American pilots admitted to unease flying such a large, complex fighter. The twin-boom design created unique blind spots. Handling was unforgiving at low speeds. And the engines, Allison V-1710s, were temperamental beasts that demanded constant vigilance. In a sense, every sortie was a negotiation between man and machine, and not all negotiations ended in peace. But war is never about perfection. It is about adaptation. And the story of the P-38 is, at its core, a story of adaptation under fire. A machine ridiculed by its enemies, doubted by its own, and nearly sabotaged by its quirks, gradually emerged as a deadly instrument when used with precision. For the Luftwaffe, what began as a joke in the mess halls of Munich became a nightmare on the high-altitude battlefields of Europe. The problem, then, was not merely technological. It was psychological. German pilots believed they understood the Lightning before they had truly met it in combat. That confidence blinded them. And when the fog lifted, literally and figuratively, they found themselves fighting not the caricature they had mocked, but a relentless opponent built to exploit their very assumptions. In the words of one Allied intelligence officer, scribbled into a confidential memo, "Mockery is a luxury of peacetime. In war, it is the first step toward defeat." At its heart, the struggle over the P-38 Lightning was less about machinery than about perception. The Luftwaffe dismissed it as ungainly, while the Americans wrestled with its quirks, yet the aircraft's twin engines, high-altitude performance, and long range gradually exposed a strategic blind spot in German thinking. The problem was clear. Underestimating an imperfect but adaptable weapon turned mockery into vulnerability. The P-38 Lightning was born out of audacity. In the late 1930s, when the world still believed in sleek, single-engine fighters, Lockheed's team under Clarence "Kelly" Johnson dared to imagine something different. What rolled out of the California factory floor looked alien. Two long booms housing engines, a cockpit pod suspended in the middle, and twin tails cutting the sky like a tuning fork. To German eyes, it was laughable. To many Americans, it was risky. But buried in that strange silhouette lay the logic of survival and reach. Start with the engines, the Lightning's twin hearts. Each Allison V-1710 generated more than 1,000 horsepower, and because they turned in opposite directions, the aircraft didn't twist or roll under torque like single-engine fighters often did. Imagine pulling back on the stick at 25,000 feet, both propellers biting into thin air. Where a Messerschmitt strained against its own torque, the Lightning rose cleanly, balanced. And if one engine failed, the other still dragged the fighter home. German pilots quickly learned that what looked like a weakness was actually a nightmare. To kill a Lightning, you had to kill it twice. But every gift has a price. Those same turbo superchargers that gave the aircraft its high-altitude superiority were notoriously fickle. Wastegates jammed, controls froze, and in the wrong conditions, power vanished. As one pilot quipped, "This bird has 2 engines, but also 2 chances to quit on you." The aerodynamics followed the same paradox. That wide twin-boom structure, mocked as ungainly, was the very reason the P-38 could remain stable where thinner air defeated other designs. Pilots seated in the central nacelle had excellent forward visibility, and the twin tails kept the aircraft steady in climbs and dives. In combat, this meant the Lightning could plummet like a spear, holding together at speeds that made Luftwaffe fighters shudder. A German ace once admitted that he had tried to follow a diving Lightning only to feel his FW-190 trembling toward destruction. Yet agility had limits. The Lightning could roll and turn surprisingly well for its size, but once locked into a prolonged turning fight, it lost precious energy. German tacticians, quick learners, advised their men to lure Lightnings into circles rather than head-on passes. If the airframe gave the Lightning survivability, its nose gave it lethality. 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm Hispano cannon all pointed forward, mounted in the nose. There was no convergence problem, no guessing range at which bullets would meet. Pull the trigger, and every round traveled directly along the pilot's line of sight. 4 Luftwaffe crews accustomed to the scatter of wing-mounted guns, facing a Lightning's concentrated stream was a brutal surprise. In debriefs, German survivors noted how short bursts tore apart aircraft as if struck by a single giant fist. Against bomber formations, the effect was even more devastating. A Lightning passing through at high speed didn't just spray fire, it carved a straight, precise path of destruction. Now consider the numbers, not as cold figures, but as the whispers inside a briefing room. Allied officers would sketch the comparisons on chalkboards, pointing to how the Lightning stacked up against the Luftwaffe's best. A Bf-109G could make around 398 miles per hour. AFW-190A pushed just past 408. The Lightning, with both engines screaming, hit 414. Margins, yes, but margins that mattered. Altitude was more telling. The German fighters gasped around 37,000 to 39,000 feet. The Lightning climbed beyond 44,000. In the high, thin air where bombers flew, that ceiling meant dominance. And then came the dagger, range. German fighters carried just enough fuel for about 500 miles, which meant they could fight near home, then had to break away. The Lightning flew more than 1,300 miles. 4 bomber crews staring at black flak bursts over Germany, this was salvation. Their escorts didn't peel away halfway. They stayed. They fought. They brought men home. For the Luftwaffe, this was not a technical note, it was a psychological blow. Their tactics had always relied on timing. Hit the bombers hard as they crossed into German airspace, then disengage before fuel needles sank too low. But when Lightnings appeared, that rhythm collapsed. American fighters were there when the bombers arrived, there when they dropped, and still there when the Germans tried to chase them back. It was like being hunted from takeoff to landing, recalled one captured German pilot. Of course, the Lightning was no perfect angel. Its flaws were real and sometimes deadly. In North Africa, cockpits turned into ovens, maps curling in the heat, pilots nearly fainting from dehydration. In Northern Europe, the opposite problem appeared, engines choking in the cold, controls stiff as iron. At high-speed dives, the wings locked, and several brave men never pulled out. Only the introduction of dive recovery flaps gave pilots the chance to survive those terrifying plunges. And for mechanics, the Lightning was double the work, 2 engines to tune, 2 sets of turbochargers to baby, twice the chance of failure. Even among American flyers, affection was mixed. Some swore by the Lightning's power and range. Others cursed its quirks and longed for the Mustang, a machine that seemed to forgive mistakes. History would eventually crown the P-51 as the escort that won Europe. But the Mustang's triumph came later. In the dark middle years, it was the Lightning that carried the bombers into the heart of Germany. Without it, those early raids would have been suicide runs. So what was the P-38, really? It was not the perfect fighter, nor the easiest to fly, nor the simplest to maintain. It was something rarer, a machine that turned ridicule into regret. German pilots who laughed at its shape discovered its reach. Mechanics who cursed its complexity still watched it bring men home on a single sputtering engine. And bomber crews, glancing left and right over flak-ripped skies, saw its twin tails and believed they might live to see another sunrise. The lesson sits quietly in the numbers and loudly in the memories. Speed just enough to keep pace, altitude to command the sky, range to change the strategy, and firepower to make every second count. The Luftwaffe believed the Lightning was a curiosity. Instead, it became a curse, proving that in war, unconventional shapes often carry the deadliest secrets. The Lightning's first true test of fire came not in the cold skies of Europe, but in the blistering sun of North Africa. It was 1942, the year when the Allies sought to crack the Axis grip on the Mediterranean. The deserts were harsh tutors, and the P-38 entered as an unproven pupil. Dust clogged filters, the sun turned cockpits into furnaces, and engines overheated with merciless frequency. Yet even in these brutal conditions, the aircraft began carving out its reputation. Imagine the scene on an Algerian airfield at dawn. Mechanics in sweat-soaked uniforms wipe sand from propeller hubs. Pilots, still green, climb into cockpits that feel like ovens even before engines roar. They know their adversaries, seasoned Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica veterans, scoff at this ungainly newcomer. And indeed, in the early sorties, the Lightning stumbled. Pilots complained of unbearable heat, maps curling in their laps, vision blurred by sweat. But then came the missions that shifted perceptions. On November 8, 1942, during Operation Torch, Lightning swept ahead of the invasion fleet. Their task was surgical: hit enemy airfields before Axis fighters could scramble. The raids were brutal and fast. German and Italian aircraft caught on the ground were torn apart by nose-mounted cannons. For the first time, Luftwaffe crews who had mocked the Lightning saw their machines burning under its guns. A diary fragment from a captured Italian mechanic summed up the shock. "We did not expect such precision. They came low, like hawks, and in moments the field was fire." The North African campaign revealed the aircraft's dual personality. On one hand, its range was invaluable. Bombers striking Tunis and Bizerta suddenly had escorts all the way in and back. On the other, pilots suffered in the punishing cockpit heat, sometimes losing consciousness. A few were found slumped over their controls, victims of the very climate they were sent to fight in. But the lesson was clear. The Lightning could project power across vast stretches of desert where no other Allied fighter could go. From North Africa, the story shifted to the Mediterranean islands, Sicily and Pantelleria. By mid-1943, Lightnings were flying from dusty forward strips, hunting Axis shipping lanes and strafing columns along the coast. One pilot's combat report captures the moment vividly: 2 ships sighted off Palermo. "We came in at mast height. Tracers walked across the deck. The freighter erupted. I pulled up so low I could see men diving into the sea." These missions demonstrated the aircraft's versatility. It was not just an escort but a strike fighter, able to carry bombs and rockets that turned it into a formidable ground attacker. Analytically, this mattered more than statistics. The Luftwaffe had assumed the Lightning was merely a high-altitude escort, a curiosity unfit for low-level work. But its rugged frame, powerful engines, and concentrated firepower proved otherwise. In fact, the very features mocked in training lectures, the twin booms, the heavy build, made it capable of absorbing punishment while delivering deadly blows. By the time Sicily fell, German pilots no longer joked. They spoke of the fork-tailed devil, a nickname that, though said with contempt, carried a grudging respect. Yet the Mediterranean was only the prelude. The real crucible awaited in the skies of Italy, where terrain, weather, and determined opposition would test not just the aircraft but the men who flew it. For the Lightning, the transition from desert sun to alpine snow was like trading one enemy for another. And in those mountains, Luftwaffe arrogance began to unravel. By late 1943, the Mediterranean had shifted from desert heat to the jagged mountains of Italy. The campaign to push Axis forces up the peninsula demanded not just infantry and tanks, but mastery of the sky. And here, the Lightning was thrown into an environment as hostile as any battlefield. Freezing altitudes above the Apennines, sudden storms rolling off the Adriatic, and Luftwaffe units determined to contest every mile. Picture an Italian airstrip near Foggia, December 1943. The ground is slick with rain, mud swallowing the boots of ground crews as they wrestle fuel hoses into reluctant couplings. Engines cough in the cold, sending white vapor into the air like dragons waking. Pilots climb into cockpits already frosted over, scraping ice with gloved hands before strapping in. They know today's target, German rail lines feeding supplies into the Gustav Line. The mission is not glamorous, but it is vital. Without supply disruption, Allied soldiers will bleed against entrenched defenses. The sorties are long and dangerous. P-38s roar low over valleys, their nose-mounted guns spitting fire at locomotives. The smell of scorched metal and oil drifts up as coal cars erupt in black smoke. Reports note how crews would fly back with fragments embedded in their wings, sometimes whole panels shredded by flak. And yet, the aircraft's twin engines often save them. Where a single hit would doom a Spitfire, a Lightning limped home on one sputtering heart, skidding onto wet runways to the cheers of exhausted mechanics. Luftwaffe pilots, many veterans of the Eastern Front, expected easy prey. The fork-tailed silhouette was unmistakable, and their briefings still described it as ungainly. But altitude changed perception. At 30,000 feet, contrails etched the winter sky like scars. German formations dove in, only to find Lightnings using superior climb performance to flip the tables. One veteran later admitted that they underestimated the American twin. "We thought it would be slow in turns. Instead, it met us head-on, and suddenly the sky was full of tracers." The Lightning's concentrated firepower proved decisive in these encounters. Pilots discovered that a short burst, perfectly aligned, could slice through even heavily armored FW-190s. Analyst notes from the period highlight how the centralized nose armament eliminated the guesswork of convergence. Where German gunners aimed with instinct and prayer, the Lightning's rounds traveled precisely where the gun sight pointed. It turned brief windows of opportunity into lethal seconds. But Italy was not just about dogfights. The terrain forced new tactics. German aircraft used the mountains for cover, ambushing bombers in narrow valleys. Lightnings, with their range and endurance, were tasked with escorting deep into this treacherous terrain. One squadron leader recalled a mission over Anzio. "We followed the bombers in, weaving above them like watchful wolves. When the Germans came, they came out of the clouds. But we were there. We always had fuel to chase them down." Strategically, this endurance broke Luftwaffe planning. German fighters could still strike, but they could not linger. Their short range meant a limited window to attack before retreating. Lightning pilots, on the other hand, had the luxury of persistence. They could loiter, circle, and hunt stragglers long after the bombers had dropped. This constant shadowing eroded German morale. It was no longer a question of if they would meet the P-38, but when. And then there were the ground attack missions, perhaps the most cinematic of all. Film reels from the era show P-38 screaming down valleys, dropping bombs that sent bridges tumbling into rivers. Pilots describe the sensation of flying low enough to see farmers scattering from their fields, engines howling as tracers stitched roads below. The aircraft's ability to carry bombs and rockets turned it into a true multi-role weapon, one that commanders increasingly relied upon. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, struggled to answer a fighter that could fight, bomb, and escort in equal measure. By the winter of 1944, the nickname "Fork-tailed Devil" had spread widely. German troops muttered it with a mixture of contempt and fear. It was meant to belittle, but the words carried grudging acknowledgment. 4 Allied flyers, hearing the enemy give their machine such a title was a badge of honor. One Lightning pilot scrawled in his journal after returning from a mission over Cassino, "They call us devils. If that means our boys on the ground can move forward, I'll wear the horns." Italy was, in many ways, the Lightning's proving ground. It showed that the aircraft was not merely an escort curiosity but a weapon capable of adapting to any role demanded by the campaign. From strafing columns in the mud to dueling Messerschmitts above the clouds, the Lightning cemented its reputation. Yet the true test still lay ahead. Beyond the Alps, in the very heart of the Reich, the bomber streams that carried America's strategy of daylight precision demanded guardians that would not fail. The P-38 had earned its place in that struggle, and soon, the skies over Germany would roar with its engines. By early 1944, the war had shifted decisively northward. The Allied bombing campaign over Germany intensified, and with it came the need for long-range escorts that could shield bomber streams from relentless Luftwaffe interception. This was the crucible for the P-38 Lightning. It had proven itself in Africa and Italy, but Germany was a different battlefield. The Reich defended its skies with ruthless efficiency, flak towers bristling in cities, radar nets tracking every approach, and squadrons of Bf-109s and Fw-190s poised to pounce. The bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, were the backbone of this offensive. But without escort, they bled horribly. Whole formations vanished in storms of cannon fire. It was into this maelstrom that the P-38 squadrons were ordered. Their mission, to fly deeper, stay longer, and bring bombers home alive. Picture a morning in early 1944. The bomber streams lift off from English airfields, wings shimmering with frost. Engines roar in synchronized thunder. Above them, the fork-tailed silhouettes of Lightnings form their protective halo. At altitude, the world turns monochrome, white contrails, gray steel, black bursts of flak. Then, out of the sun, the hunters arrive. Dozens of Messerschmitts dive in, guns flashing. The first encounters were brutal. German aces, veterans with dozens of kills, sized up the Lightnings. They exploited weaknesses, the P-38's tendency to compress in steep dives, the cockpit that could frost over and obscure vision. In the opening weeks, Lightning squadrons took painful losses. Reports tell of entire flights lost in minutes, their formations shattered by disciplined German attacks. Pilots described the fear vividly. The sky seemed full of black crosses. Everywhere you looked, another burst, another tracer. Yet the Lightning's strengths began to assert themselves. Its range meant it could accompany bombers deep into German airspace, far beyond the reach of most fighters. Its firepower, concentrated in the nose, made head-on duels particularly deadly. German pilots accustomed to wing-mounted gunfire found themselves shredded in a single, accurate burst. Analysts later noted that in the cold logic of statistics, Lightnings required fewer rounds to down an opponent than almost any Allied fighter. There was also resilience. Many accounts speak of Lightnings limping back with engines aflame, wings perforated, fuselages scarred by cannon shells. Pilots owed their lives to those twin engines. In one mission over Regensburg, a Lightning returned across the channel with half its tail shot away, one engine dead, and ailerons barely responding. Its pilot staggered from the cockpit, pale and trembling, but alive. Stories like this circulated rapidly, bolstering the machine's aura of toughness. Tactically, squadrons adapted. They learned to exploit altitude, climbing above bomber streams to dive on attackers before they reached their prey. They also shifted to more aggressive escort strategies. Instead of flying tight with the bombers, Lightnings pushed outward, intercepting German fighters earlier and engaging them on their own terms. The psychological effect was immediate. Luftwaffe units could no longer count on easy approaches. Every attack carried the risk of running headlong into a pack of determined fork-tailed devils. But Germany was a place of relentless danger. Flak tore through formations with mechanical cruelty. Black bursts filled the sky like ink blotches, each carrying lethal steel fragments. Lightning pilots learned to weave constantly, engines screaming as they dodged invisible death. One pilot recalled how the cockpit smelled of burnt insulation after a near miss, the acrid stench mixing with his own sweat. "It felt," he wrote, "as if the air itself was hunting us." Despite these terrors, the Lightning earned grudging respect even from German aces. Reports from Luftwaffe intelligence briefings acknowledged its formidable range and climb, noting that attacks must exploit its dive compression weakness. The fact that such notes existed was telling. The fighter once mocked now merited careful tactical study. Perhaps the most dramatic episode came during the massive raids on Berlin in March 1944. It was the first time the capital of the Reich faced full-scale daylight bombing. Hundreds of bombers, shielded by Lightnings and other escorts, penetrated deep into the heart of enemy territory. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had: fighters, flak, desperation. The battles lasted hours, the sky a chaos of smoke trails and fireballs. Lightnings dove, climbed, turned, and fired until their ammunition was spent. One squadron returned with less than half its planes intact, but the bombers had reached their targets and delivered their loads. In this campaign, the Lightning proved a paradox. It was not always the easiest to fly, nor the most forgiving. Pilots cursed its quirks, its compressibility in dives, its unreliable heaters in sub-zero cockpits. Yet, when survival hinged on endurance, range, and firepower, the Lightning was indispensable. Without it, the bombers would have been naked. With it, they had a fighting chance. By mid-1944, the tide in the air war had begun to shift. Luftwaffe losses mounted unsustainably. Fuel shortages bit hard, pilot training declined, and even the most experienced aces found themselves facing waves of determined escorts. Among them, the fork-tailed devil carved a reputation not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of relentless pressure. Germany's skies were no longer a sanctuary. And yet, the Lightning story in Europe was not done. Ahead lay the summer of 1944, when the Allies would launch the greatest amphibious invasion in history. The P-38 would be there too, its silhouette etched over the beaches of Normandy, its guns blazing in defense of the most ambitious gamble of the war. June 6, 1944. The day the world remembers as D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in history unfolded on the beaches of Normandy, and above that armada of ships and men, the skies thrummed with the sound of Allied aircraft. Among the swarms of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires, the unmistakable silhouette of the fork-tailed Lightning carved its presence. From the first light of dawn, P-38s flew missions critical to the success of the invasion. They strafed coastal defenses, tore into convoys rushing to the front, and patrolled high above the beaches to intercept any Luftwaffe sortie daring enough to challenge the Allied juggernaut. A British observer on a Channel ship noted in his log, "Twin-tailed fighters streak overhead, diving like falcons. The men on deck cheer every time their guns chatter." For soldiers storming ashore, the Lightning was more than an aircraft. It was a guardian in the sky. The Normandy campaign showcased the Lightning's versatility like no other. Equipped with bombs and rockets, it operated as a fighter bomber, hammering German positions behind the lines. Pilots attacked bridges, fuel depots, and troop columns with ruthless efficiency. One after-action report describes a mission near Cannes, dropped ordnance on rail yard. Secondary explosions visible for miles. Entire trains set ablaze. Enemy transport crippled. These strikes strangled German logistics, ensuring their reinforcements reached the front too slowly to repel the invasion. But Normandy also revealed the Lightning's enduring challenges. Dogfighting over the hedgerows of France, some squadrons found themselves outmatched by nimble German opponents when forced into tight turning fights. Compressibility in dives remained a deadly hazard, claiming aircraft even without enemy fire. Pilots grumbled, comparing their mounts unfavorably with a newer P-51 Mustang, which was beginning to dominate escort duties. Yet the Lightning's ability to carry heavy ordnance and still fight back kept it relevant. It was less the duelist now and more the hammer, shaping battlefields through relentless ground attack. By autumn 1944, as the Allies pushed eastward, the P-38 followed. Missions took it deep into occupied Europe, chasing retreating German forces across Belgium and the Netherlands. In these months, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Shortages of fuel and trained pilots left them struggling to mount coherent resistance. Lightnings roamed with near impunity, striking airfields, convoys, and even tanks. One squadron diary entry captured the shift. Today we saw only 3 enemy aircraft. Spent most of the mission bombing a column of trucks. Hard to believe how far we've come since Italy. Still, danger lingered. The winter of 1944 brought the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. The Luftwaffe threw its remaining strength into counterattacks, including the infamous Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, when German fighters struck Allied airfields. P-38 squadrons were among the targets. Many Lightnings were destroyed on the ground, but those airborne turned the tide with fierce resistance. In the chaos, their concentrated firepower once again proved devastating, downing attackers even as flames rose from wrecked aircraft below. As the war neared its end, the Lightning continued to adapt. By spring 1945, its missions were less about survival and more about strangling what little remained of the German war machine. Strafing runs against locomotives, armed reconnaissance deep into Bavaria, and attacks on retreating convoys became routine. Pilots flew lower, faster, with near-total dominance of the skies. 4 German troops retreating under Allied advance, the twin booms overhead meant only destruction. And then, in May 1945, it ended. The Luftwaffe was shattered, cities lay in ruins, and the fork-tailed devil had completed its European journey. Its service was not without flaws. It demanded much from its pilots, punished mistakes harshly, and was eventually overshadowed by the Mustang in pure escort roles. Yet, in every phase of the European war, from the sands of Africa to the mountains of Italy, from the frozen skies of Germany to the beaches of Normandy, the Lightning left its mark. Narratively, the Lightning's arc mirrors the war itself. Mocked at first, blooded in failure, tempered in adversity, and ultimately triumphant. A machine that embodied the paradoxes of modern war, innovative yet flawed, fragile yet resilient, underestimated yet feared. One German veteran summarized it best after the war: "When we saw the twin tails, we knew trouble had come." For the pilots who flew it, the Lightning was more than metal and engines. It was memory, comradeship, survival, and sacrifice. Their stories, recorded in diaries and debriefings, speak not just of combat but of endurance. Hours in freezing cockpits, endless vigilance, the weight of escort duty where one mistake meant a bomber crew's death. They lived with its quirks, cursed its flaws, but relied on its strength. By the time victory was declared, the fork-tailed devil had carved a permanent place in the annals of aerial warfare. Its silhouette would never be mistaken, its reputation never forgotten. For every pilot who saw it, friend or foe, the Lightning was proof that innovation, when tested in fire, could change the course of history. Every aircraft of World War II carried its own myth, and myths often distorted reality. The P-38 Lightning was no exception. To Allied crews, it was a lifesaver, tough, versatile, and long-legged. To Luftwaffe pilots, it was the fork-tailed devil, a nuisance that grew into a threat. Yet when compared side by side with its contemporaries, the Lightning revealed both brilliance and compromise. Take the P-51 Mustang. By late 1944, the Mustang had become the darling of bomber crews and fighter pilots alike. Its laminar flow wing, Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and sleek profile made it both fast and agile, with the range to escort bombers deep into Germany. Compared to the Mustang, the Lightning seemed bulky, complex, even clumsy in certain situations. Pilots complained that it could not match the Mustang's nimble turns or smooth dive recoveries. And so, in the mythology of the air war, the Mustang became the hero, while the Lightning slipped into the shadow. But that is only half the truth. In missions requiring sheer versatility, escort, ground attack, interception, the P-38 excelled in ways the Mustang could not. Its ability to carry bombs, rockets, and cameras for reconnaissance made it indispensable. Its twin engines gave it survivability unmatched by any single-engine fighter. And its nose-mounted guns remained some of the most accurate of the war. Had the Lightning not been deployed in numbers before the Mustang's arrival, many bombing campaigns would have been crippled. Against the Luftwaffe, the comparison shifts again. Facing the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190, the Lightning held its own. In straight-line speed, it often matched or exceeded them. At altitude, thanks to its turbo superchargers, it outperformed many German designs. Yet in tight turning contests, especially at medium altitudes, German fighters retained the edge. Pilots who tried to duel on German terms often paid dearly. The mistake was not in the aircraft but in tactics. The Lightning was never meant to be a knife fighter. It was a hammer, built for decisive strikes and relentless endurance. Then there was the matter of compressibility, a flaw that haunted the Lightning throughout the war. At high speeds in steep dives, airflow over the wings and control surfaces caused the aircraft to lock up. Pilots described the stick as turning to stone, elevators refusing to respond. Some never pulled out, plunging helplessly into the earth. Engineers eventually fitted dive recovery flaps, a partial solution, but the reputation lingered. Luftwaffe pilots, quick to exploit enemy weaknesses, learned to lure Lightnings into dives where control failed. It was a bitter lesson in how cutting-edge design sometimes ran ahead of aerodynamic understanding. Climate, too, exposed mistakes. In the tropical heat of North Africa, cockpits turned into ovens, sapping pilots of strength. In the freezing altitudes over Germany, heaters often failed, leaving men numb and half-blind behind frosted canopies. Maintenance crews wrestled with twin engines that doubled both workload and chances of mechanical failure. The Lightning was powerful, but it was also temperamental, demanding care that few frontline conditions allowed. Strategically, one could argue the Allies misused the Lightning at times. In Europe, where the Mustang eventually took the primary escort role, the P-38 might have been better concentrated as a fighter-bomber and reconnaissance platform. In the Pacific, where long distances dominated strategy, it thrived. There, with fewer high-performance Japanese interceptors and endless expanses of ocean to cover, the Lightning became legendary. In Europe, its record was mixed not because it lacked ability, but because expectations often mismatched its true strengths. Perhaps the greatest mistake was not technical or tactical, but perceptual. From the start, Luftwaffe propaganda mocked it as clumsy. Even some Allied pilots, trained on more agile single-engine fighters, regarded it with suspicion. That bias shaped its reputation, lingering even after it proved itself repeatedly in combat. History is written not only in numbers but in sentiment, and sentiment often favored sleeker, simpler machines. The Lightning's complexity, 2 engines, twin booms, unusual silhouette, made it an outsider. Outsiders rarely win the beauty contest, even when they win battles. Yet if we peel back the myths, the balance sheet is clear. The P-38 delivered unique capabilities that no other Allied fighter matched. Its range extended Allied reach across continents. Its firepower shredded both aircraft and ground targets with precision. Its resilience saved countless pilots who might otherwise have perished in single-engine designs. Its flaws were real: compressibility, climate issues, maintenance demands, but they were not fatal. The true mistakes lay in underestimating what the Lightning could do, or misusing it in roles where its weaknesses outweighed its strengths. In the end, comparing the Lightning to other aircraft is less about crowning a winner and more about understanding a mosaic. Each fighter filled a niche. The Mustang was the rapier, elegant and deadly in duels. The Thunderbolt was the bludgeon, indestructible in ground attack. The Spitfire was the scalpel, unmatched in agility. And the Lightning? It was the strategist's tool, a versatile, long-legged hunter that brought the war to places no other could reach. To judge it solely by dogfights over Europe is to miss its broader impact. When Luftwaffe veterans spoke after the war, many admitted their mistake. They had laughed at the fork-tailed devil when it first appeared. By 1944, they no longer laughed. They respected it, even feared it. And in that reversal lies the essence of the P-38 story: underestimated, doubted, flawed, and yet indispensable. And yet, beyond the numbers and tactical debates, the story of the Lightning did not end in the dogfights above Germany or the valleys of Italy. The consequences of its design, its victories, and even its failures rippled far beyond 1945, shaping the doctrines, technologies, and memories that defined the rest of the century. To understand the Lightning fully, one must not only weigh its performance in battle but trace the imprint it left on the world that followed. Strategically, its greatest gift to the Allies was endurance. Before its arrival, daylight bombing campaigns were costly gambles, waves of B-17s and B-24s crossing into hostile skies with only the hope of survival. With the P-38, for the first time, there was a fighter that could stretch across the continent, stand guard beside the bombers, and still fight on equal terms with the Luftwaffe. Even when the Mustang later claimed the role of Europe's escort darling, the Lightning had already proved the concept that long-range escort was not a luxury, but a necessity. From then on, no serious Air Force could imagine a doctrine that separated striking power from protective reach. The war forced the lesson, and the Lightning etched it into the DNA of modern air power. But there was another, subtler inheritance. The Lightning's flaws, its compressibility dives, its temperamental engines, its demand for disciplined flying, became teachers as well. Every mishap and every near disaster forced engineers and pilots to wrestle with the physics of high-speed flight. Out of those struggles came breakthroughs, dive recovery flaps, turbo superchargers that squeezed power at altitude, cooling solutions that kept engines alive where others faltered. These were not abstract improvements. They were stepping stones into the jet age. Pilots who once fought the Lightning's quirks would later climb into the cockpits of F-80s and F-80s, carrying forward lessons written in blood and adrenaline. In this sense, the P-38 was less a dead end than a bridge. Its silhouette, too, left echoes. The twin-boom layout that looked alien in 1941 became iconic, inspiring later designers to reconsider symmetry, balance, and airflow. Even if few copied it directly, the audacity of its form gave permission to experiment. It proved that unconventional thinking could not only fly but win wars. For those who lived under its wings, however, the Lightning's legacy was less technical and more visceral. To the bomber crews it escorted, it was salvation. Two tails on the horizon meant they might make it home. To ground troops in Italy and France, it was a thunderbolt ripping into German convoys. To Luftwaffe veterans, it was a riddle that turned mockery into caution, then into fear. And in the Pacific, where its range became a weapon in itself, the Lightning grew into legend. It hunted across oceans, struck at shipping lanes, and carried out the mission that killed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in 1943, a single operation that sealed its place in history. For many Americans, especially those following the war through newspapers and newsreels, the fork-tailed silhouette was not just another fighter, it was the face of the Pacific Air War. Memory, of course, is never purely factual. Propaganda films painted the Lightning as unstoppable. Veterans remembered it with a mixture of reverence and frustration, depending on whether it had saved their lives or claimed their friends. But in the end, myths matter as much as statistics. They shape how nations remember their wars. And in memory, the Lightning soared higher than its critics ever expected. Doctrinally, it left another enduring truth: versatility matters. Unlike the single-minded Spitfire or the specialized Stuka, the P-38 wore many masks. Escort fighter, ground attacker, reconnaissance platform, maritime strike aircraft, it did all of these with competence, sometimes brilliance. Future aircraft like the F-4 Phantom or F-16 Falcon would embody the same philosophy: a single machine able to adapt to the shifting demands of war. In that sense, the Lightning was an ancestor of the multi-role fighters that dominate skies today. But its most profound inheritance was human. Thousands of pilots wrestled with its controls, learned its temperament, and etched their survival stories into its aluminum skin. Their diaries speak of freezing altitudes, of fuel gauges dropping to zero over the Alps, of the eerie silence when one engine failed and the other strained alone. To them, the Lightning was no abstraction. It was a companion that could be both angel and devil. One veteran, reflecting decades later, summed it up with brutal honesty: the Mustang was a sweetheart. The Lightning was a warrior. She asked more of you, and if you respected her, she would bring you home. If you didn't, she would kill you. Even after 1945, the aircraft lingered. Reconnaissance variants mapped shattered Europe and charted Cold War borders. Civilian versions carried mail, cargo, and even racing ambitions. But time is merciless. By the late 1940s, Jets eclipsed props, and the lightning, once cutting edge, became an anachronism. Yet even as relics, its survivors carried a strange magnetism. At airshows, when restored P-38's thunder overhead, crowds fall silent before the fork-tailed ghost. Children see not a museum piece but a living relic of a time when the future of nations depended on machines and the men who dared fly them. Perhaps the most telling proof of its impact is in the nickname that endures. Fork-tailed devil, a phrase born in mockery, hardened in respect, and remembered in fear. Few aircraft wear their history so openly in their epithet. It encapsulates the lightning's journey, underestimated, tested, and finally vindicated. To Allied soldiers it was salvation, to enemies a nightmare, to pilots both lover and executioner. In the end, the P-38 Lightning was never perfect. But perfection was never its purpose. Its purpose was reach, endurance, and pressure, the kind that bends enemies until they break. In that, it succeeded. And its legacy, written across doctrine, technology, and memory, remains a reminder that even flawed machines can change the course of history. And so, as the echoes of the lightning fade into history, what remains are not just technical footnotes or tactical debates, but lessons carved in steel and sacrifice. The first lesson is humility. For the Luftwaffe, mocking the ungainly twin-boom fighter became a bitter irony. Underestimating an enemy weapon is as dangerous as overestimating your own. Wars are littered with such mistakes, and the lightning stands as a permanent reminder that ridicule can turn to fear in a heartbeat. The second lesson is adaptability. The lightning's journey, from misunderstood escort to multi-role backbone, proved that flexibility is survival. Machines that cannot evolve are left behind. Doctrines that refuse to adapt collapse. In today's world of drones and stealth jets, that truth still holds. Versatility is not a luxury. It is the heartbeat of air power. The third lesson is human. Behind every statistic lay a pilot staring down frostbite, exhaustion, or death. The P-38 demanded discipline, punished recklessness, and rewarded respect. It forged a generation of flyers who carried their experiences into the jet age, into civilian aviation, into history books. Their stories remind us that technology alone does not win wars. It is the bond between human and machine, the trust, the fear, the perseverance, that tips the balance. And perhaps the final lesson is perspective. The lightning was never perfect. But war rarely gives the luxury of perfection. What it offered was enough. Range, power, survivability. Enough to shield bombers over Germany. Enough to cut supply lines in Italy. Enough to hunt across Pacific horizons. And enough, ultimately, to help bring a world war to an end. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it still, the twin Allisons growling across a winter sky, contrails carving scars into the blue, tracer fire flashing in the thin air above Europe. For some, that sound was terror. For others, it was salvation. For history, it was transformation. And now, as we step back from this story, I invite you to carry it forward. Because history only lives if we keep telling it, sharing the lessons, remembering the sacrifices, honoring the machines and the men who flew them. If this journey through the saga of the lightning has resonated with you, there is more to uncover, more stories to tell, across deserts, oceans, and battlefields where iron birds decided the fate of nations. So don't let this be the last flight. Subscribe to the channel, join us as we dive deeper into the hidden corners of history, and let the voices of the past continue to speak through the roar of engines and the silence of memory. And if you found yourself transported, if you could smell the oil, feel the frost, hear the thunder of combat, then leave a comment, share your thoughts, and become part of this ongoing mission to make history vivid, cinematic, alive. The lightning taught us that even the underestimated can change the world. Perhaps, in remembering it, we remind ourselves of the same truth. Never dismiss. Always learn. Respect the past to shape the future. And as the fork-tailed devil disappears into the clouds of memory, one truth lingers, as sharp as the contrails it once carved. History is not a relic. It is a living story, waiting for us to tell it again.